Hi, I'm Melissa at Ciccio. Last week we asked some of our followers to ask some questions if they had any. A lot of you did. We really thank you for the awesome questions you sent us, and we just thought it would be a little more thorough and in-depth and more interesting if we answered, or Joe answered, those questions on video. So here they are. So, who exactly is Columbus?
That's a very good question that actually no one ever asks, right? So much animosity, and I'm not saying it's not justified, over someone that no one ever even asks. Who exactly was he? Cristoforo Colombo, that was his straight up Italian name. His name in his native dialect would have been, I think, something like Cristofa Carombo, something like that. But he was from Genoa. And the Genovese were a seafaring people. So, like in Game of Thrones, the people from Pike, right, were clearly a seafaring people. In Italy, you had the Venetians in Venice, and you had the Genovese in Genoa, were seafaring people. And as I've mentioned before, Italia was not a united country. So you had basically a series of kingdoms or republics, city-states in the north, which were often self-ruled, and in the south, almost completely occupied by foreign forces that were usually Spanish or French. So Colombo was from Genova and was an excellent explorer, admiral, and he was hired by the Spanish, by the Queen Isabella and the King Fernando, who was also, at the same time, the King of Sicily. And it's very erroneous, the notion that we have developed today that everyone thought the world was flat. That is false. Even in antiquity, we're talking 1,000, 2,000 years before that, there were definitely people that presumed that the world was most likely round because, contrary to Kyrie Irving, there are experiments that anyone can do to suggest that reveal the likelihood that the earth is probably round. What he was trying to do, and what he died thinking he had accomplished, was finding a previously unknown route to India. Upon the return of his first voyage from what we now call the Americas, his dispatch, his report to the monarchs of Spain and the Pope, which is available online, was the account of what anyone today would consider a batshit crazy religious and capitalistic zealot. So everything he's doing, he's clearly doing in the name of the Spanish monarchs and the Catholic Church, according to him. So he's recounting his encounters with the natives, which is sort of his descriptions of his encounters are sort of half abhorrent by our notions today and half understandable if you have a grasp on the human story. So here you have whether you are Christian, European, or frankly, much, if not most, of the Muslim, European, and Asian world, which are all sophisticated for its time in terms of technology, in terms of an interconnectedness of commerce and governance. You're talking about an encounter with people who are comparatively very simple. Now, simple does not have to be derogatory. And my impression of most of the Native American culture he encountered is not a million miles away from a lot of Buddhist and Zen lifestyle in terms of your relationship with the earth and the land, and being selfless enough in your psychology to not think that the universe revolves around you, but that you are an organic part of the natural landscape, which by now we should understand is what we are. And so he's writing about how they're such a simple people that seem to have no notion of government, they have no notion of arms, and they seem almost cognitively simple as animals. Where he's coming from is a place of literal shock and astonishment. By any measure, it was also opportunistic. And his suggestion to the monarchs of enslaving these people, as legitimately abhorrent as we see that notion today, it again was not all that abnormal a psychology for the times he lived in, whether you were Christian or Muslim. Because the notion that both Christians and Muslims had was that the other was an infidel. And the form of slavery that he was offering to the Spanish monarchs, he was offering it because, as I mentioned in another video, that was the slavery that the Spanish monarchs, or that Spanish society, had implemented in Spain already for at least 100 years. Now today, we rightly see that as abhorrent, but that's not a million miles away of things that were culturally normative among Native Africans, among Native Asians, among Native Muslims, among Native Christians. What made it truly remarkable, and by remarkable I don't mean to insinuate virtuous, but what made it truly something amazing was how it led, after Columbus's death, to the invention of systemic and entrenched racism and slavery in the centuries that followed in this hemisphere, which was a slavery pretty different than slavery in the past in the Eastern Hemisphere. So even if you are in ancient Egypt in 2000 BC, okay, your fellow Egyptian, the pharaoh, shows up to your village or your city and informs you, you are going to spend the rest of your life building my tomb, the pyramid. And that's going to be essentially the story of you. So yes, you were fed, you didn't have to worry about your room and board, but that is what your life is going to be spent, as a worker to build that pharaoh's tomb. In ancient Rome, 500 BC through 400 AD, Okay, your teacher may very well be a slave. Your doctor, your physician may very well be a slave. And it may be a fellow Roman, it may be a Greek, it may be a German. But like in ancient Egypt, it's not based on racism. And it's very difficult for us to wrap our brains around that today. You likely had one day off a week, you were paid a wage, so that come time for your retirement, you can buy your freedom and take your nest egg and retire to your own house or dwelling. Or whether you were a Christian enslaved by Muslims. That really is sort of the beginning of what we get to, of what we're coming at now in terms of modern racism. Is the Christian enslaving the Muslim enslaving the Christian, because now it's not just the social order of things that everyone just takes for granted, including the slave. Now it's based, because of religiosity, on the notion that you are an other, whatever that is. In the sense of religiosity, you are an infidel. Now that's whether it's a Muslim looking at a Christian or a Christian looking at a Muslim. And in the time of Columbus, you're talking the 1400s, Spain and Portugal were essentially in a race across the sea that starts with Africa. And the explorations of Africa that come with the maritime explorations of new routes. And so it's the Portuguese and the Spanish that are encountering African islands like the Canary Islands, that then enslave the people of those islands because they are infidels. Now that's the excuse, and in a time of such religiosity, you have people that actually believed it, and some people that maybe just used it as an ostensible excuse for commercial enterprise and colonialism, the Spanish and the Portuguese. And so by the time Columbus hits what the Europeans and Africans and Asians would have considered the New World, even though he thinks it's India, it's a whole brand new market for the commercial, religious, and institutionalized forms of entrepreneurialism and slavery already in place. Fairly quickly, Columbus was on the outs with the Spanish sponsors of his voyage. And the Spanish monarchs had clearly laid out the options before them. Are we going to enslave these people who are infidels, ostensibly giving them the choice, the alternative, to become Christian? But it's really an excuse for capitalistic and imperialistic growth. Or do we not? And Spain chose to go ahead with it. Everyone in the United States is obsessed with the year 1619 as the year of slavery, brought about by the British. But 100 years before that, the Spanish were already importing African slaves to the New World, which really was something else. And the previous world of antiquity really had little example of, where it's not even the conquered people who are, as per human history, whether it's Africa, Asia, or Europe, are now enslaved. It's the fact that this is a brand new market that is untapped. We're going to also import slaves, people who are conquerable in another unrelated land, and import them as part of the capital that comes in capitalistic enterprise to work this and develop this new market. And ostensibly, it's for religious purposes. But what happens is Columbus is dead, convinced that what he discovered was a new route to India, and you have the rest of the Spanish venturing deeper into what would become Latin America, what parts of what today are the United States South, encountering more Native Americans, the Inca, the Aztec, the Seminole, implementing more foundations of slavery over the natives, and now the influx of the Africans the Spanish are bringing. And it was the British, the Anglos, in what would become the United States, that followed suit. And what Latin Americans refuse to acknowledge is the fact that the sources of their Latinidad were the people that invented and crafted and consciously put in place the slavery that was a new form of slavery previously unheard of, that is a slavery based, that would eventually become based on ethnicity. And in the years that follow, in the centuries that follow, where the religious element is really no longer in place, no one's bullshitting anymore that you're infidels whose souls are damned, and so it is just for us to put you at our service as people who are saved through Jesus. It's now become, through the establishment of the Spanish caste system in Latin America, that you now have the foundations of what becomes today racism. In Mexico, you want to see the list of caste categories throughout Mexican history? It'll blow your mind. How could you possibly keep track of all this? People who are predominantly Spanish, i.e. white European, but part Native American, are above people that are part Spanish, i.e. white European, but part African, i.e. black. Other people that have their own level in the societal caste system who are part Spanish, i.e. white and European, part Native American, part African, i.e. black. Okay, these were caste systems created by Spanish institutions. I should not have suggested as much as I did that what was happening was a capitalistic enterprise. It was an imperialistic enterprise, right? Capitalism means private ownership. Imperialism, in the way that communism on this earth has meant, is all done for and through the state. So, yes, Columbus, the conquistadores, all those, they're doing it on behalf of the state, which ultimately profits the state of Spain. So it's not actually capitalism, it is profit driven, and Columbus did intend to profit extremely. The Spanish crown screwed him out of his profits, and after he died, his sons actually sued the Spanish monarchs for profits legally owed him, certainly not morally owed him. That imperialistic profit motive led to what actually was the perversion of capitalism, which was American, as in USA American slavery, which, like La Mafia, is capitalism at its worst. La Mafia is capitalism at its worst. So, for instance, with both mafia, la mafia siciliana, and slavery in the United States, you're dealing with agrarianism, agrarian capitalism, where you have the land, which in Sicilia is the olive grove or the sulfur mine, okay? You have the laborer as a second element, which would be regular Sicilians. And then in capitalism, you have the third element, which is the influx of capital, which is usually money. Capital to start you up, and then allegedly, hopefully through profits, capital that gets reinvested into the venture. But in the architecture of mafia, you have the land, the lemon grove, the worker, the Sicilian, and the third influx, the capital, is the violence. Whereas in American slavery, you had the land, which is the cotton field. You had the laborer, which is the African slave. And even though it's not really a third element, it's part and parcel with the laborer. It's sort of the inverse of capital, creating a lack of overhead and a need for capital is the fact that the laborers are working for free. So you have private enterprise that has the regular elements of capitalism, but through a perversion of what capitalism should be, it's quite obviously immoral. Interesting. The right-wingers are really good at acknowledging that capitalism inherently means choice, which means freedom, as opposed to communism, which was state-run and leaves you no choice. But right-wingers tend to be really bad at coming to terms with our inherent ability to choose poorly, to choose in ways that are self-detrimental through capitalism. Whereas the left wing, I feel, is very good at identifying the poor choices, the self-detrimental and immoral choices that we make through capitalism, but that they are very loath to acknowledge that even in our poor choices within capitalism, those poor choices are indicative of the fact that we have freedom to choose. Also in Columbus's first dispatch back to Europe from his first voyage, he talks about how the natives that he encountered explained to him how natives from a neighboring island would hunt them down and capture and enslave them. How the natives that he first encountered apparently didn't know anything about arms, but the natives from the neighboring island would fashion spears and arrows out of branches and whatnot. And he actually tells of how he and his men saved and rescued two young boys who had been native boys who had been captured by the neighboring natives and to be slaves, or literally eaten through cannibalism. And when they rescued them, they found that these two native boys had been castrated by their fellow native neighbors. People who on one hand were so innocent of spirit and beautiful of spirit that they didn't need arms. And yet the native neighbors of these people were cannibals and hunted other people from that land. The human complexity is truly awesome, try to imagine what it was like for the natives to discover these Europeans arriving. Columbus, in that same dispatch, talks about how these natives thought that they were men from heaven. So think about it in terms of the technology, the size of their ships. You know, the conquistadores had firearms. Okay. Think about the closest solar system to ours. Okay. You're talking about a solar system that is 25 trillion miles away. You're talking about 4.5 light years away. Now what that means is it takes light 4.5 years to travel between our solar system and the next closest solar system. But nothing on Earth moves remotely at the speed of light. If the space shuttles travel at 18,000 miles an hour, it means it would take our space shuttles 1 billion years to travel to the next closest solar system. So, if aliens were to come to Earth, if they came from the closest solar system to us, not another one that is still farther, it means that they have mastered such a technology that must at least approach the speed of light, so that their voyage is more like 4 years instead of 1 billion. You're talking about technology that to us would seem supernatural, like magic. And if you're talking about intelligent life that has evolved enough to use that type of technology in their ordinary life, you're talking about intelligent life that must be of a physical presence and ability in terms of evolution, that even their physical presence to us would probably seem supernatural or like superheroes or magic. So imagine if you are the Taino people who themselves were more simple than the Aztecs. The Aztecs, much farther up these continents in the Western Hemisphere, who were a much more complex society in terms of technology, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of architecture, in terms of governance. The Tainos are even more less complex. You're looking at people come off of what, for all you know, could look like what we would think of as spaceships, with their arms and this shrewdness, not to be mistaken for more intelligence, but a shrewdness of violence as an option, of commerce, which itself may contain violence, of a type of religiosity, even by now, among Christians, let alone amongst Muslims, among Christians and Muslims. They truly must have been of this beautiful naivete that left them open to exploitation, whereas even the Aztecs, farther up the continents, were more shrewd, because the Aztecs, who themselves must have had more of a psychology akin to the Europeans than to the Tainos, because the Aztecs themselves conquered other native people. So today, if you are a Mexican, or even within Mexican society, which itself is a remnant of the Mexican caste system, and predominantly you happen to be a Mexican who predominantly identifies as a native, an indigenous. And therefore, let's say an Aztec as an example. That's now we consider you Aztec. But during the time of the Aztecs, if you were of someone that was just a little farther north, if you were of a Mexica people that were just a little farther north, you didn't necessarily self-identify with the people coming from farther south, the Aztec people, who have now violently conquered your people and assimilated you into Aztec society. But now that the ascension of Europe, and by extension, the ascension of European America, which by the way includes Latin America, is what has at this point in history won out. At this point in history, we, as well as you, look back or look at you as just Aztec. Or think about the Muslim Ottomans. 40 years before Columbus came here, Istanbul was the Christian Roman capital of a Christian Roman civilization. When the Emperor of Rome, when the Romans made Istanbul, it's the capital of Rome, which was a Christian civilization at that point, that happened 300 years before Islam existed. So by the time it's the 1450s, you're talking about people that for millennia are Christian and Roman and indigenous. And the Muslim Ottomans had a generational obsession with conquest and imperialism against Istanbul, which at the time was called Constantinople. And 40 years before Columbus succeeded in doing such here, the Muslim Ottomans succeeded in their militaristic, religious, imperialistic quest to infiltrate and conquer the native Christian Roman people of Istanbul and Turkey. So my point is, humanity is layered. Whether you are the Carthaginians in Africa, obsessed generationally with conquering a people who are living on their own land in Italy, whether you are the Muslim Ottomans generationally obsessed with militarily conquering through imperialism what was a Christian European and Asian civilization in Istanbul, or whether you are the Aztecs who have as a goal and a mission to conquer other people from what are today the Americas and assimilate them into your society, whether you are then Columbus, who opened the door and quickly stepped out of the way for the Spanish and the Portuguese and eventually the British to do the same thing in this hemisphere. As I've stated before, everyone on earth is knee-deep in the shit, and everyone's shit stinks. And if you are looking back at whoever your particular beautiful people's history is, and you haven't found their atrocities, you just haven't looked back far enough. So what I might suggest is to take a page out of Nelson Mandela's book, which is how about all of us in today's day and age, in which we agree that our human atrocities should no longer fly. How about all of us sit in a circle, look at each other in the eye, And God forbid we put our hands on each other's shoulders. I'm Italian, we do that. And how about we do not deny our truths, and we all figure out, what can we do together from here on out?